So in this section of the course, we're going to be talking about Azure Batch Service. Now, Azure Batch Service, as the name implies, allows you to upload batch jobs into the cloud and have Azure manage the execution. Now, a batch job is basically any job that needs to be rerun 1,000 times, 100,000 times, millions of times on different pieces of data. This could be examples such as simulations, weather predictions, rendering of a movie, etc. So anytime you've got lots of identical tasks that can be run in parallel, then you can consider building it as a batch job. And Microsoft will manage creating the virtual machines and managing the tens and hundreds of thousands of virtual machines required to execute them. So instead of having a single virtual machine that takes 48 hours to do a simulation and render a result, well, then you can use an Azure Batch Service, have that done in parallel, and perhaps in an hour to have the answer instead. Now, Batch Service requires a batch account. So in this video, we're going to create our first account that we're going to then use to log in to the Azure Batch Service. This is separate than your Azure subscription. Now, it chose my subscription by default and put me into a resource group. I'm going to let it stay in that resource group. We do have to give it a name, and see here that the name is fully qualified, including the region. And so this name has to be unique across this region within Azure. So I'm going to call this AZ-SJD Batch. Hopefully no one's taken that. Now, instead of running this in East Asia, which I'm going to scroll down here, we can see that it's identifying it here. Let's choose something a bit closer to us. So I'm going to choose East US. Okay, right there in the United States. Now, specify an optional storage account. For best performance, we recommend a storage account, a general purpose V2, located in the same region as the batch account. So let us go through that process of selecting a storage account. Now, I do have my Cloud Shell storage, but I'm going to create a brand new storage account. I'm going to call it Batch Storage. And it's a general purpose V2 it asked for, so I'll create that. And I'll create standard performance, and we don't need storage redundancy, so LRS for this account. So we have our new batch account running in our subscription and a resource group. We've given it a name, picked a location, and it's going to create a storage account for us. Okay. Continuing on to the next screen, we do have a way of allocating the pool. Okay, so whether the batch service manages the allocation of all those nodes, or whether it's going to be in our subscription, that's a decision that needs to be made. We're going to leave the default here. Tags, just like creating a virtual machine, we won't set up tags. And now we can review the batch account. So we're signing up for batch service. It's going to create a storage account for us. I'm going to click create, and then I'll have a batch account that I can start to use. So this is our Azure batch account. It got created in the region that we created it. We have a URL that represents our batch account. And to me, this looks a lot like a virtual machine. We've got the overview screen, tells us a bit about it. And if we were to minimize this or scroll down, we can see some monitoring graphs right on the overview. Now, of course, the monitoring for the batch service is different than the monitoring for a virtual machine. So we're going to see tasks, nodes, failed tasks, and the minutes that it's consumed. These are more in line with what you care about when you're talking about running batch jobs. Okay, let's open this back up, and we're going to go into the quick start section. And we could, obviously download PowerShell to be able to do stuff like that. I want to look at some sample code, because as developers, looking at sample code is sort of one of the easiest way to try to understand what's going on. When you click the sample code from within that batch service, it takes you to GitHub. No surprise, the Azure Samples user has Azure Batch Samples repository. And so we can see, I'm going to scroll down so we can see the README file, that there are languages for .NET, Python, Java, Node.js. And it tells you a little bit about the prerequisites. You're going to need a batch account. You're going to probably want to use Azure Storage to be able to see inside of those of your storage account in order to upload the files and jobs that are needed. Batch Explorer will tell you in a visual way how your batch jobs are running. And Batch does support Docker, and so there's a separate area to go if you want to look at batch support for Docker. We just want to dip our toe into a little bit of code here. So I'm going to go into the C# directory. And again, this is a number of sample code that we can start to look at and play with. It's going to tell you Visual Studio is required, and it's going to basically build the samples by getting the dependencies, etc. How you configure your credentials. There's a configuration method. Tells you more about the samples. Now I want to get into the getting started one because that's the obvious place to start, and we're going to get into Hello World. I mean, Hello World is an obvious first program you're going to run when any type of new programming situation. So here's a Hello World file. We could obviously clone this, download the code, load this into Visual Studio, compile it, etc. I'm going to go into the program.cs, and we can see here that it's a very short program. There's only 160 lines of code. If we look at the public class program and the main method, which is what starts up when the program runs, it really just sets itself up and runs this hello world in an asynchronous fashion using the wait method, which basically fires it off and it just goes into a wait state waiting for it to finish. Okay. The hello world task, the asynchronous function that gets called, does some basic command, console write lines when it starts, gets the credentials for the batch account. So remember, we created a batch URL, got a batch name. There's going to be a key associated with that as well. And then it's going to basically open up the batch client. It's going to create a job called Hello World Job. And it's going to submit what it wants to run and then await for the job to complete. So it's a very simple controller, basically, is what it is. Orchestrator. And so this is the job, submit job async. Coming down to submit job async method, creates the job, and it's going to create a pool. So we basically have to create the app world pool, get the configuration settings for that. We have virtual machine size that we want, the operating system, number of nodes, etc. That's all in the configuration file, which we'll see in a second. And the core of it here is that it's basically running a batch job that says, basically command line job that runs the echo command that just says hello world from the batch hello world sample. So each of the virtual machines, when we look at the target nodes and stuff like that, is going to basically run this command. It's going to just basically echo back a hello. And that's the purpose of Hello World anyways. So that's pretty much how you interact with a batch job using code. So go into GitHub, find this repository under Azure Samples User and the Azure Batch Samples repository. You can fork this or clone it and basically start from there in terms of starting to interact with batch. There's a number of samples. We just looked at the whole hello world. If we want to do something more than just say hello, the next one up is this pools and resource files. You can certainly read through this README. It does a little bit more than the hello world sample. And number 3 extends from that. So we're getting sort of a gradual increase in the complexity. So go check out those samples. It's an easy way to get started with the Azure Batch. All right, so let's demonstrate this by downloading the code from GitHub. I'm going to download the entire repository, Azure Batch Samples. Now we saw there's a number of samples in this besides the hello world, But for this example, we can just demonstrate compiling and running the Hello World sample. So I downloaded the zip file to my local and I unzip it. Now, of course, if you have Git, you can obviously clone the repository and do it that way. Now, inside of this unzipped folder is the various folders, and we can get into getting started. We can see that Hello World does exist. Now, you will need a Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code for this. I do have Visual Studio 2017 installed, so I'm going to open this project in Visual Studio 2017, but I do hear great things about Visual Studio Code, and I'm going to hopefully test that out later on. So let's go into the downloaded codes repository. I'm going to navigate into the code here, into getting started, and then Hello World project specifically, open up the solution file. So that opens within our Visual Studio environment. Now I'm going to do a compile of this just to ensure that all of the dependencies have been built. Okay, so we waited until the code was loaded. It says that it has. I'm going to say build solution, or you can hit F6. And we can see that it doesn't take too long for both the common project and also the Hello World project to compile. Now, we did review the code in the last video, so we're not going to go through it line by line again. We can see there is a settings file for this code, and it does tell you the number of nodes, the virtual machine instance size, and the pool ID, etc. So you can have batch and job specific settings in that file. And then there's this file for account specific settings. You're going to need to go to the Azure portal and go into your batch account and grab the account name and the account key, and then go and grab the storage account name, a storage account key, etc. I'm blurring this out so that you don't see my keys, but these keys shouldn't work after today anyways. So I'm going to build it again based on that updated key. I'm going to hit rebuild, and we can see it compiles. Now the question, of course, is sure it compiles, but does it actually work? So I'm going to hit either F5 or the green triangle there. Now I did put a breakpoint in here so I can step through the code, and we can see the part of the common project which loads the configuration. Unfortunately, it's looking for the JSON file to be in a specific directory. So I actually do have to copy the account settings JSON from the common project into the Hello World project. Now, of course, we could set up our build scripts in such a way that the account settings JSON goes into the proper place, or change the code to look for it in the common project. But, you know, out of laziness, it's easier just to copy it. Run it again, and this time it's able to load the values for that account settings JSON. So it's loaded it, and then we've run it through the configuration builder. And now we're going to kick off the job in the asynchronous way. I'm still stepping through the code, and it's, of course, going to write to the console a few lines, where it's going to grab a credential because of the batch account needs to have, a batch service needs a credential in order to interact with it. So passing in the URL and the account name, account key returns a credential. This is interesting. This is a retry provider policy, and you can see that it's the exponential retry provider, and it's basically going to see if the job gets retried 5 seconds exponentially, which is interesting. So we can see that as we step through it, the console has output all of these keys, and it's going to run. Now this takes a few minutes to run. Okay, so it's right now it's uploading the job into the batch account. If we go over to Azure portal, so we're going to have to go into the Azure portal and go into the batch service. And if I try to open in Batch Explorer, you do have to have the software installed. I'm going to download the software just out of interest to see what this batch job looks like in the Batch Explorer. So I'll download that in the meantime. But if you look at the Azure portal here, you can see that the program is still running. So let's install the Batch Explorer. It asks to have access outside the firewall. I'm going to have to log into my Azure account. So this is my Azure account credential. So this is the Azure Batch Explorer. Now we can see here that it's pulled my Azure account in once I logged in, and I can see my batch account, the AZ-203 batch account, and we can see that how things have been going so far. Now I've tested this job once and it took a few minutes to run. It takes quite a few minutes to run actually. And the job started and complete. But right now I have it running. We have it running again. So we can see that this is still waiting for tasks to complete. And this is the way that we're going to get insights. So we have the job, and we can see that the job has one task, task 1, active. Task is currently active and there's no output to view yet. So we're here waiting. It's taken 4 minutes so far. Here waiting for the task to execute. Can navigate back up to the summary view. We can see that there's one job queued, and that's the only job, and it hasn't succeeded or failed yet. It's still in that state. So this is how we get insights into what the batch is doing behind the scenes. We can see that the job has started again. So I ran it once and now I'm running it a second time. And it's been running for a few minutes. One has been started, one is completed. If we look at the pools, select a pool from the list, we can see that we have 2 nodes part of the pool. Remember, we did that in the settings. It's going to cost me 25 cents an hour for that type of pool. So we can see that the nodes are dedicated, transitioning, and now we just have to wait for the task to complete. It does take a few minutes. The task is running. I'm now looking for output files. Ran for 3 seconds and completed. Okay, so if we go back up here, it says task completed. If I go to the command line, it says standard out hello world from the batch hello world sample. So this is the output of the task we uploaded to Azure Batch Service. Press return to exit. So the code is successfully completed, and it took a few minutes to get it set up, and it takes about 3 seconds of runtime in terms of the actual work that we asked it to do. It's a very basic hello world program. So the Azure Batch Explorer, really interesting way to see your tasks in motion. If you've got a really complicated job with hundreds of tasks or thousands of tasks, then you'll definitely see the value of being able to peel away under the hood and see what your nodes are doing and how busy they are and how close they are to completion.